A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was quiet in that particular way that meant autumn was surrendering to winter, when the last stubborn leaves had finally fallen and the birds had long since flown south, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through bare branches and the occasional rustle of some small creature burrowing down for the cold months ahead. And Sarah Moonwhisper had learned over her 24 years of lonely existence that this kind of silence was both a blessing and a curse, because it meant she could work without interruption, gathering the last of the silver-cap mushrooms that grew in the shadowed places where sunlight barely reached. But it also meant that the only voice she'd hear all day would be her own, talking to herself like a madwoman, just to remember what human speech sounded like after weeks of solitude. Her long silver hair, so pale it looked almost white in certain light, catching the weak autumn sun filtering through the nearly bare canopy above, fell past her waist in waves she'd stopped bothering to properly braid weeks ago, because what was the point of looking presentable when the only living souls who saw her were the rabbits and deer who'd grown bold enough to eat from her hand, recognizing her as just another fixture of the forest, as permanent and unthreatening as the old oak trees that had stood sentinel here for centuries before she was born, and would likely stand for centuries after she died, alone and unmourned in her little cottage at the edge of the forgotten woods. She knelt beside a cluster of the mushrooms she'd been seeking, their distinctive silver-gray caps dotted with tiny white spots that made them look like someone had splattered them with starlight, and carefully harvested them with the small knife she kept strapped to her thigh. The only weapon she owned, and one she'd never used for anything more violent than cutting herbs and preparing food. Because Sarah had never been a warrior, and never would be, despite the fact that she was a shifter like everyone else in the Shadowmere pack. Or at least she was technically still part of that pack, even though they'd essentially forgotten she existed 2 years ago, when they'd given her this cottage and told her she could live here and make her potions and remedies, and they'd buy them from her when they needed them. But she shouldn't expect to be included in pack gatherings or ceremonies or anything that involved actual community, because her silver hair made people uncomfortable, reminded them too much of old stories about cursed bloodlines and ancient magic that most modern wolves preferred to forget had ever existed in the first place. 7, 8, 9, 10. She counted aloud as she placed each mushroom carefully into her gathering basket, her voice sounding strange and rough from disuse, because it had been 3 weeks since anyone from the pack had even come out this far to buy potions. 3 weeks of talking only to herself and the animals. 3 weeks of silence broken only by her own rambling thoughts spoken into the empty air, like prayers to a goddess who'd clearly forgotten she existed just as thoroughly as her pack had. That should be enough for the winter fever remedy old Marta wanted last month, though whether she'll actually come to collect it or just decide she doesn't need it, after all, is anyone's guess, isn't it? The rabbit who'd been following her through the forest, a plump brown creature with one ear that flopped sideways in a way Sarah found endlessly endearing, twitched its nose at her from beneath a fallen log, and she smiled at it with genuine warmth, the kind of expression she never showed to the few pack members who occasionally ventured out this far, because she'd learned that showing emotion to wolves who didn't care about you was just asking for pity or mockery, neither of which she could stomach. "What do you think, Hopper?" she asked the rabbit, using the ridiculous name she'd given it months ago when it had first started appearing during her morning gathering trips, probably because she left bits of carrot and lettuce outside her cottage door, and it had learned she was a reliable source of food, which was more than most pack members had ever done for her. "Should I make the remedy anyway, even if no one comes for it? Or should I just assume they've found someone else, someone less creepy to buy from? Someone whose hair doesn't make them think of ghosts and bad omens and all the other delightful things I've been called over the years?" The rabbit, predictably, had no opinion on the matter and simply hopped away toward whatever rabbits did with their days when they weren't begging food from lonely Omega healers. Sarah stood slowly, her knees protesting slightly from kneeling on the cold ground, and brushed dead leaves from her worn skirt. The fabric patched in so many places it was hard to remember what color it had originally been, though she thought maybe it had been blue once, back when she'd lived in the pack orphanage and worn hand-me-downs from whatever children had outgrown them first. Back before she'd been sent here to live in isolation because her presence made the other pack members uncomfortable, and the Alpha had decided it was easier to hide her away than deal with the whispers and superstitions that followed her wherever she went. The walk back to her cottage took 20 minutes through increasingly dense forest, following a path only she knew existed because only she ever used it, and with each step, she felt the familiar weight of loneliness settling over her shoulders like a physical thing. Heavy and cold and suffocating. The kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by a pack who treated you like you didn't exist, who looked through you rather than at you, who forgot your name even when you'd lived among them your entire life. And she found herself wondering, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, what the point of having a gift for healing was when no one wanted to be healed by you. What the point of being part of a pack was when you lived in exile. What the point of surviving was when you'd stopped actually living years ago and were just going through the motions of existence. Day after empty day, season after season, year after year, with nothing to look forward to except more of the same endless solitude. Her cottage came into view through the trees, small and shabby but sturdy, with smoke from this morning's fire still wisping from the chimney, and her little herb garden, now mostly dead for winter, spread out in neat rows beside the front door, and she felt the complicated mixture of emotions she always felt when returning home. Relief at having a shelter and a place that was hers, but also a deep sadness at coming back to empty rooms where no one waited for her, where no warm greeting or friendly smile or simple acknowledgement of her existence would be offered. Just silence and solitude and the echoing loneliness of her own thoughts. She pushed open the door, which creaked on hinges she kept meaning to oil, but never quite got around to fixing, and stepped into the single room that served as her kitchen, living area, bedroom, and workshop all at once, with dried herbs hanging from every available beam, bottles and jars of remedies lining makeshift shelves along the walls. Her narrow bed shoved into one corner and barely wide enough for her small frame. A battered table where she took her solitary meals and studied the precious books Elena had left her. And the fireplace that was the heart of the space, currently burning low and needing more wood added if she wanted to stay warm through the evening. She set her gathering basket on the table and immediately went to the bookshelf, a rickety thing she'd built herself from scavenged wood, where Elena's collection of old texts sat in a place of honor, the only valuable things she owned, and pulled down the largest volume, its leather cover cracked and worn from centuries of use, its pages yellow with age and covered in handwriting from dozens of different healers who'd added their knowledge to its contents over generations, and she flipped to the section she'd been reading obsessively for the past month, the one about soul weavers, those legendary healers with silver hair who could supposedly interact with cursed souls and break dark magic with their touch, and whose bloodline had been hunted to near extinction centuries ago by those who feared their power or coveted it for themselves. Soul weavers are marked by hair, the color of moonlight, and eyes that hold the storms of winter. She read aloud, her finger tracing the faded text. And they possess the rare gift of seeing beyond the physical body to the soul itself, able to sense curses and corruption, able to heal wounds of spirit as well as flesh, able to break bonds that others cannot even perceive exist, and their greatest power lies not in knowledge or technique, but in love freely given. For a soul weaver's kiss offered without expectation of reward can break even the darkest curse, can free even the most tormented soul, can accomplish what centuries of magical study cannot achieve, because true healing comes not from power, but from genuine connection, from caring without condition, from choosing to see the worth in someone that others have overlooked or forgotten, or deemed unworthy of notice. She closed the book with a soft thump that seemed too loud in the silent cottage, and stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror that hung beside the fireplace. Seeing her silver hair that had caused her so much trouble over the years, her pale skin that people said made her look like a ghost or a corpse, her gray eyes with their strange silver flecks that caught light in unsettling ways, and she laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no real humor in it, because the idea that she could be descended from these legendary healers, that her appearance could mark her as something special rather than something cursed, was so absurd it was almost funny. Right, because forgotten Omegas who live alone in the forest and talk to rabbits are definitely legendary soul weavers, she muttered, turning away from her reflection and moving to add wood to the fire, because the cold was seeping in through the poorly chinked walls, and she needed the warmth, needed something to push back against the chill that lived in her bones and had nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with years of isolation and rejection. Elena must have left me these books as a joke, trying to make me feel better about being a freak by telling me stories about magical bloodlines and special gifts, as if having silver hair means anything other than that I'm different, and different means unwanted. She prepared a simple dinner of vegetable stew from her garden's harvest, carrots and potatoes and onions that she'd grown herself because no one else was going to feed her, and ate it mechanically while reading more about soul weavers, because even if she didn't believe she was one, the stories were fascinating. Tales of healers who'd saved entire kingdoms, who'd broken terrible curses, who'd been valued and cherished and seen as blessings rather than burdens. And it was nice to imagine, even for a moment, what it would feel like to be wanted like that, to be important, to matter to someone, to anyone, in a way that went beyond just being useful for making remedies that people bought without even looking at your face or speaking your name. Night fell early this time of year, and with it came the sounds that always made her nervous. The howling of wolves in the distance who might be pack members or might be rogues. The crack of branches that could be wind or could be something more dangerous, and she barricaded her door the way she always did, not because it would actually stop a determined shifter, but because it made her feel slightly safer, slightly less vulnerable, slightly less aware that she lived alone in the wilderness with no one to protect her, and no one who would even notice if she disappeared. She was preparing for bed, banking the fire and washing her single plate and cup, when she heard it, a sound that made her freeze with her hands still in the wash basin, water dripping from her fingers back into the bowl, with tiny splashes that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence, and the sound came again, scratching at her door, weak and desperate. Not like a predator trying to break in, but like something dying, something that needed help, something that was using its last strength to beg for aid from whoever might be inside this small cottage in the middle of nowhere. Every survival instinct Sarah possessed screamed at her to ignore it, to stay inside where it was safe, to not open the door to whatever was out there in the darkness, because nothing good came from letting strangers into your home, especially strangers who showed up after dark, especially when you lived alone with no one to protect you, and no one who would avenge you if something went wrong. But the scratching came again, accompanied by a whimper so pitiful, so full of pain and desperation, that she felt something in her chest crack open. That healer's heart she'd tried so hard to protect behind walls of cynicism and learned helplessness, and she found herself moving toward the door before rational thought could stop her. her hand reaching for the bolt, even as her mind screamed that this was stupid. This was dangerous. This was how forgotten Omegas ended up dead. She pulled open the door and the cold night air slammed into her along with the sight that would change everything. A massive wolf collapsed on her doorstep. Silver fur matted with mud and old blood. Ice blue eyes that held far too much intelligence and far too much pain, looking up at her with desperate hope, and on his chest, just visible through the dirt and grime, a mark that glowed faintly in the darkness. A symbol she recognized from Elena's books, a curse mark. The sign of dark magic that bound and trapped and slowly killed. And she realized with stunning clarity that this wasn't just any wolf. This was a shifter who couldn't shift back. Someone trapped in their animal form. Someone dying. Someone who had somehow found her door in the vast wilderness and was asking, without words, but with everything they had left, for help that only she might be able to give. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared down at the massive silver wolf bleeding on her doorstep, and for one long moment that stretched into eternity, she stood frozen between two equally terrifying choices. The choice to drag this enormous creature into her tiny cottage where it could easily kill her if it chose to, or the choice to close the door and condemn it to death in the freezing night. And she realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that there really wasn't a choice at all, because she'd spent her entire life being the one left behind, the one forgotten, the one deemed not worth saving. And she wouldn't refuse to help another living being who was suffering right in front of her. Even if helping meant risking everything she had. Even if everything she had wasn't much to begin with. "You're probably going to kill me for this," she whispered to the wolf, whose ice blue eyes tracked her movements with an awareness that was far too human, far too intelligent, and she saw in those eyes a depth of exhaustion and pain that went beyond physical injury, a weariness that spoke of years of suffering, of hope repeatedly crushed, of a soul that had been broken so many times, it barely remembered what wholeness felt like, and something in her recognized that feeling because she carried it inside herself every single day. "But I can't leave you out here to die. I can't be that person. I've already had enough taken from me without losing my humanity too. So you're going to have to promise me, if you can understand what I'm saying, that you won't eat me or tear my throat out or do whatever it is enormous silver wolves do to foolish Omegas who make terrible decisions in the middle of the night." The wolf made a soft sound, almost like agreement, or maybe it was just dying, and that sound was its last breath. And Sarah couldn't tell which possibility terrified her more, so she did what she always did when faced with impossible situations. She acted without thinking too hard about the consequences and stepped out into the cold night air, her thin nightgown offering absolutely no protection against the biting wind, and grabbed the wolf's front legs with strength she didn't know she possessed, strength born of desperation and determination, and that stubborn refusal to give up that had kept her alive through 2 years of isolation. Dragging the wolf inside was the hardest physical labor she'd ever done in her life. Harder than chopping wood for winter, harder than hauling water from the stream, harder than any of the endless tasks that filled her solitary days, because this creature was massive, had to weigh at least 200 pounds of solid muscle and thick winter fur, and it was dead weight, unable to help her at all, its legs dragging uselessly as she pulled and heaved and cursed under her breath, her bare feet slipping on the cold ground, her muscles screaming in protest, sweat breaking out on her forehead despite the freezing temperature, and she thought she might actually die from the effort, might collapse right here in her doorway and be found in the spring by some passing traveler who would wonder why there was a dead Omega and a dead wolf tangled together like some tragic tableau. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because stopping meant giving up, and she'd had enough things give up on her in her life without becoming someone who gave up on others. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she had the wolf inside her cottage, sprawled across the floor in front of her fireplace, taking up most of the available space in her tiny home, and she slammed the door shut behind them and threw the bolt with shaking hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body trembling from exertion and shock, and the dawning realization of what she'd just done, which was invite a potentially dangerous predator into the only safe space she had. And if this went badly, there would be no one to save her. No one to even know she'd died. No one to care that the forgotten Omega of the Shadowmere pack had finally met her end at the jaws of a creature she'd been stupid enough to help. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice shaking almost as badly as her hands, talking to herself again because it was the only way she knew to process what was happening, to create some sense of order in the chaos that her quiet, lonely life had just become. "First things first, I need to assess the damage. Need to see what I'm dealing with here. Need to figure out if you're going to die in the next 5 minutes or if I actually have time to help you. And then I need to figure out what that mark on your chest means, because I've seen drawings of curse marks in Elena's books, but I've never seen a real one, never actually encountered dark magic in person, and I'm not entirely sure I'm qualified to deal with this. But then again, I'm not qualified to deal with most things, and yet here I am, still surviving, still pushing forward, still refusing to just lie down and die like everyone probably expects me to." She dropped to her knees beside the wolf, ignoring the way her nightgown was getting soaked with melted snow and mud from its fur, ignoring the fear that made her want to back away and hide in the corner until morning, ignoring everything except the immediate need to help this creature who had somehow found its way to her door, and she let her hands hover over its body, calling on the healing sense that Elena had taught her to develop. That magical awareness that let her feel injuries and illness in living things. That gift that was the only thing about herself she'd ever been grateful for, because it meant she could help, even when no one wanted help from her specifically. The healing sense flared to life inside her, warm and bright and tingling in her fingertips, and what it showed her made her gasp aloud. Because this wolf wasn't just injured, it was dying, had been dying for a long time. Years, possibly, its life force slowly draining away like water through cupped hands, and the curse mark on its chest was the source, a dark, magical anchor that was killing it incrementally, day by day, moment by moment, feeding on its strength and vitality, until there would be nothing left but an empty shell. "Oh no," she breathed, her gray eyes filling with tears she didn't entirely understand. Grief for a stranger who was suffering. Grief for all the pain in the world that she was helpless to fix. Grief for herself and her own loneliness reflected back at her in those two intelligent, ice-blue eyes. "Oh no, what did someone do to you who could curse another living being like this? Who could be cruel enough to trap you in this form and let you suffer for what must have been years? And how are you even still alive? How have you survived this long when the curse should have killed you months or years ago?" The wolf's eyes closed slowly, as if even keeping them open was too much effort, and Sarah felt panic spike through her chest like a physical blade, because she couldn't let this creature die, couldn't fail at the first real test of her abilities that had ever presented itself, couldn't prove to herself and the universe that she really was as useless and forgettable as everyone had always treated her as being. So she did what she'd been trained to do, what Elena had spent years teaching her before the old Omega had died and left Sarah truly alone in the world. She pushed past her fear and her doubt and her certainty that she wasn't good enough for this, and she started working with hands that gradually stopped shaking as they found their purpose and their rhythm. She cleaned the wolf's wounds first, the visible ones, the gashes and cuts that spoke of recent fights or accidents, washing away dried blood and dirt with water warmed over her fire, her touch as gentle as she could make it, and the wolf bore her ministrations without protest, without even a growl or snap, as if it understood she was trying to help, as if it trusted her in a way that made her chest ache with emotions she couldn't name. Because when was the last time anyone or anything had trusted her? Had looked at her with something other than discomfort or dismissal or outright disgust? "You're being very brave," she murmured as she worked, falling into the habit of talking to her patients that Elena had encouraged, saying that the sound of a soothing voice could help healing as much as any medicine. "I know this must hurt. I know you're exhausted and scared, and probably wondering if you made a terrible mistake coming here. But I promise I'm going to do everything I can to help you, even if I don't really know what I'm doing, even if I'm just a forgotten Omega who lives alone and talks to rabbits. I'm still going to try because trying is all I know how to do. Trying and surviving and refusing to give up, even when giving up would be so much easier." After she'd cleaned the visible wounds and applied poultices made from the herbs hanging from her rafters, healing salves she'd prepared weeks ago, never imagining she'd be using them on a cursed wolf in the middle of the night, she turned her attention to the curse mark itself, that glowing symbol on the wolf's chest that pulsed with sickly dark energy, and she felt her healing sense recoil from it instinctively, recognizing the dark magic as something corrupt and wrong and fundamentally opposed to the life-giving energy she channeled when she healed. She'd read about curse marks in Elena's books, knew they were created through blood magic and dark rituals, knew they could trap shifters in one form, or bind their powers, or slowly drain their life force. But reading about something and actually confronting it were entirely different experiences, and she found herself utterly uncertain about what to do next, because the books had been frustratingly vague about how to actually break such curses, talking about true love and pure hearts and sacrifice in ways that seemed more like fairy tales than practical instruction. "I don't know how to break this," she admitted to the wolf, her voice cracking with frustration and fear and the terrible weight of inadequacy she'd carried her whole life. "I don't know how to undo dark magic. I'm just a healer, just someone who knows herbs and basic healing spells. I don't know anything about curses or how to break them, and I'm so sorry because you came here hoping I could help, and I'm going to fail you just like I've failed at everything else that mattered. Just like I failed to make my pack want me. Just like I failed to be someone worth remembering. Just like I've failed to be anything other than a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives." But even as she spoke those words of defeat, even as she felt the familiar embrace of self-loathing and hopelessness, trying to pull her down into the dark places in her mind, where she sometimes got lost for days, she remembered something Elena had said to her years ago, back when Sarah was 16 and had just presented as an Omega and been rejected by every potential mate in the pack because of her silver hair. Back when she'd been sobbing in the orphanage kitchen, and Elena had held her and stroked her hair and told her something that had seemed like empty comfort at the time, but now echoed in her mind with new significance. "The greatest healing doesn't come from knowledge or technique, child. It comes from connection, from caring, from choosing to see the worth in someone that others have overlooked. And your gift isn't just the ability to sense injuries and mix remedies. Your gift is your heart, your capacity to care even when caring has brought you nothing but pain. And someday that gift will save someone in ways you cannot imagine. Someday your refusal to give up on people will matter more than all the magical knowledge in the world." Sarah reached out with trembling fingers and placed her hand directly over the curse mark. feeling the dark energy writhe and pulse against her palm like something alive and malevolent. And she channeled her healing sense into it, not trying to fight it or destroy it, because she didn't have that kind of power, but just trying to understand it, to see what it was doing and why and how, and what she found made her gasp aloud, because this wasn't just any curse. This was a binding curse that could only be broken by true love's willing kiss, the kind of fairy tale magic she'd thought was pure myth, the kind of romantic nonsense that existed in stories, but not in real life, except here it was, real and terrible, and slowly killing this wolf who had somehow endured it for years. "Someone cursed you to only be freed by true love," she whispered, and the wolf's eyes opened to look at her, and she saw in them such depths of pain and resignation and bitter acceptance that she understood immediately this wolf had tried to break the curse before, had probably tried hundreds of times with hundreds of different people, and every attempt had failed because the love hadn't been real, hadn't been freely given, hadn't been pure enough or genuine enough, or whatever impossible standard the curse required. And now this wolf had given up hope, had come to her door not expecting to be saved, but just seeking a place to die with someone nearby, someone who might care enough to at least acknowledge its passing. "I'm going to keep you alive," Sarah said, and it was a promise, a vow, the kind of commitment she'd never made to anyone because making promises meant risking failure, and she'd had enough failure in her life without actively seeking more. "I don't know how to break your curse. I don't know if anyone can break it, but I'm going to keep you alive while we figure it out. I'm going to feed you and care for you and make sure you don't die in this cottage, because you fought so hard to get here. You survived so long against impossible odds, and I won't let that struggle be for nothing. I won't let you die alone the way I've been living alone. I won't give up on you even if you've given up on yourself." She worked through the night, brewing special teas from the silver moonflowers she grew in her garden, the rare plants that seemed to thrive under her care despite being notoriously difficult to cultivate. Flowers that Elena had told her were connected to old magic, to the soul weaver bloodline, though Sarah had never quite believed that connection was anything more than superstition and wishful thinking. But now she used them anyway because she had nothing else to offer. Nothing but her determination and her herbs and her stubborn refusal to accept that some things couldn't be healed. The wolf drank the tea she offered, its rough tongue lapping weakly at the liquid she held to its mouth, and she saw the curse mark pulse and writhe, as if the healing properties in the tea were causing it discomfort, as if even her simple remedies were enough to annoy the dark magic, even if they couldn't break it. And that gave her a small spark of hope, the tiniest flicker of belief that maybe she could help after all. Maybe her gifts weren't as useless as she'd always thought. Maybe there was a reason this wolf had found its way to her door specifically. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside her single window, painting the world in shades of gray and pink that were almost beautiful if she'd had the energy to appreciate beauty, Sarah finally collapsed beside the wolf, exhausted beyond measure, her body aching from the physical labor of dragging it inside and the magical drain of healing work that had taken everything she had to give, and she rested her head against its silver fur without thinking about whether it was safe or appropriate, because she was too tired to maintain the walls she usually kept around herself, too tired to remember she was supposed to be afraid, too tired to do anything except seek comfort in the warmth of another living being who was still breathing, still alive, still here. "Don't die," she whispered against its fur, and it might have been a prayer or a plea, or just the desperate wish of someone who'd been alone too long and couldn't bear to lose the first real connection she'd felt in years, even if that connection was with a cursed wolf who couldn't speak and might be gone by morning. Please don't die. I know I'm nobody. I know I'm just a forgotten Omega who probably can't help you the way you need. But please don't die tonight. Give me time to figure this out. Give me a chance to try. Because I think maybe the universe sent you here for a reason. Maybe we're supposed to help each other. Maybe two broken souls can somehow make each other whole. Or maybe I'm just talking nonsense because I'm exhausted and emotional and putting meaning into randomness because I want so desperately to believe that anything in this world happens for a reason instead of just being chaos and cruelty and endless disappointment. She felt the wolf shift slightly, felt its massive head turn toward her, and then, in a gesture so gentle it made her eyes fill with tears, it rested its muzzle against her shoulder. A silent acknowledgement, a wordless thank you, a moment of connection between two creatures who'd been alone too long, and Sarah wrapped her arms around its neck and held on like it was the only solid thing in a world that was constantly shifting beneath her feet, and she felt something crack open inside her chest. Some wall she'd built around her heart to protect herself from caring too much about anything or anyone, because caring meant pain when those things inevitably left or forgot about her, or decided she wasn't worth the trouble. I'm going to save you, she promised again, and this time she almost believed it, almost convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, a forgotten Omega and a cursed wolf could find a way to break dark magic through sheer stubborn determination, and the kind of desperate hope that came from having nothing left to lose. They stayed like that as the sun rose fully, two silver-haired creatures wrapped around each other in a tiny cottage at the edge of the forgotten woods, and Sarah fell into an exhausted sleep thinking about soul weavers and true love's kiss and curse-breaking magic, not knowing that 3 days from now she would kiss this wolf and change both their lives forever, not knowing that the dark magic slowly killing him was about to meet its match in a woman who'd spent her whole life being overlooked and underestimated, not knowing that sometimes the most powerful magic in the world wasn't about strength or knowledge or ancient bloodlines, but about a lonely Omega who couldn't walk away from suffering and a dying wolf who'd found her door in the darkness and decided to trust one more time. And as she drifted off to sleep with the wolf's warmth against her and the sound of its steady breathing filling the silence she'd lived with for so long, Morgana Darkrose sat in a stolen throne 300 miles away and felt through her dark magic the moment the curse mark faltered, felt the first crack in the spell she'd woven 4 years ago, and smiled a terrible smile because she'd been waiting for this, waiting for someone to try to break her curse so she could finally track down the Alpha King she'd trapped and kill him before he could reclaim everything she'd stolen. And she whispered to the shadows that served her, "Find them. Find whoever is trying to break my curse, and bring me the wolf, and whoever dares to challenge my magic. Bring them to me so I can show them what happens to those who interfere with a witch's vengeance." 3 weeks had passed since Sarah had dragged the dying wolf into her cottage. 3 weeks of careful nursing and gentle care and whispered conversations, where she told him everything about her lonely life, because talking to him felt safe in a way that talking to humans never had, because he couldn't judge her or pity her or decide she wasn't worth his time. He could only listen with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul and understand things she'd never been able to put into words. And during those 3 weeks, something had shifted inside her chest. Some fundamental change in the way she saw the world and her place in it, because for the first time in her 24 years of existence, she wasn't alone, wasn't forgotten, wasn't just surviving in isolation, but actually living with purpose, even if that purpose was just keeping one stubborn wolf alive against all odds. The wolf had grown stronger under her care, could stand now and walk slowly around the cottage, could eat the food she prepared and drink the healing teas she brewed from her precious silver moonflowers. But the curse mark remained, pulsing with dark energy on his chest, a constant reminder that time was running out, that the dark magic was still killing him slowly, that all her herbs and potions and healing spells were only delaying the inevitable unless she could figure out how to actually break the curse. And she'd spent every spare moment reading through Elena's books, searching desperately for some clue, some technique, some forgotten piece of knowledge that might save him. She'd learned that he understood everything she said, had seen the intelligence and awareness in his eyes when she read to him from her books, had watched the way he responded to her words with subtle movements and expressions that were far too human for any normal wolf, and she'd found herself falling into the habit of treating him not as an animal she was caring for, but as a person, as someone who mattered to her in ways she was afraid to examine too closely, because examining those feelings meant confronting the terrifying truth that she was developing emotions for a cursed wolf she'd never even seen in his human form, that she cared about him in ways that went beyond healer and patient, beyond Omega and injured shifter, beyond anything she could rationally explain or justify. "I had another dream about Elena last night," she told him on the morning of the 21st day, as she prepared breakfast for both of them, oatmeal with dried berries and honey for her, venison she'd bartered for from a passing hunter for him, because even though the pack had essentially abandoned her, they still occasionally sent people to buy her remedies, and she could trade those for the supplies she needed. She told me the same thing she's been telling me every night for the past week, that the silver marks the bloodline, that I'm what you need, that I should trust my heart, and I don't know what it means. I don't know if I'm actually receiving messages from beyond death, or if I'm just so desperate to help you that my mind is creating dreams that tell me what I want to hear, that somehow I'm special enough, powerful enough, important enough to save you when hundreds of others have apparently tried and failed. The wolf watched her with those intense blue eyes, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch, some emotion that looked almost like longing, almost like hope, almost like he wanted to tell her something desperately important, but couldn't find the words because he had no words to give, trapped as he was in this form, and she knelt beside him and cupped his massive head in her hands, her fingers threading through his silver fur, and she felt the now familiar ache in her chest that came whenever she touched him, that strange, pulling sensation that Elena's books had described as the beginning of a mate bond, but that couldn't possibly be what this was, because mate bonds happen between two people in human form who chose each other consciously, not between a forgotten Omega and a cursed wolf who might not even want her once the curse was broken, and he could see what a pathetic, lonely, ordinary thing she really was beneath the silver hair and the healing gifts. "I wish I knew your name," she whispered, and it wasn't the first time she'd said it, but the longing in her voice was stronger now, more desperate, because knowing his name would make him real in a way he wasn't quite yet, would transform him from the wolf to a person with an identity and a history and a life that existed before he'd collapsed on her doorstep. "I wish you could tell me who cursed you and why. I wish you could tell me how long you've been suffering. I wish you could tell me if there's anyone out there looking for you, worrying about you, wondering if you're alive or dead, because surely someone as magnificent as you must have people who care, must have a pack, or a family, or someone who's noticed you're gone. And maybe, if I knew more about the curse, I could figure out how to break it. Maybe, if I understood the magic better, I could find a solution that doesn't require impossible things like true love's kiss. Because how can anyone give true love to someone they've never properly met? How can feelings be real when they're based on 3 weeks of one-sided conversations and healing sessions and the desperate intimacy of caring for someone who can't care for themselves. She fed him his breakfast, watching the way he ate more enthusiastically now than he had in the early days, a sign that her treatments were working, even if they couldn't cure him, and she felt a fierce pride in that small victory, in the fact that she'd kept him alive this long when the curse had clearly been designed to kill him. And she thought about what Elena had told her in last night's dream, about trusting her heart, about the silver marking the bloodline, about being what he needed, and she made a decision that was probably stupid and definitely reckless, but felt right in a way that few things in her life ever had. "I'm going to try something," she said, and her voice was shaking but determined, the voice of someone who'd spent too long being passive and forgotten, and was finally ready to take action, even if that action might fail spectacularly. "The books say that dark curses, especially binding curses that trap shifters in one form, can only be broken by true love's willing kiss, and I know that's probably impossible. I know you've probably had hundreds of people try to kiss you, hoping to break the curse and claim whatever reward comes with saving a clearly important wolf, but none of them worked because they didn't really love you. They loved the idea of you, or the power you represented, or the status they'd gain, but they didn't love you for who you actually are, for your soul, for the person trapped inside this curse." The wolf had gone very still, every muscle tense, and she saw something that might have been fear or hope or desperate disbelief flicker across his expression. And she continued, words tumbling out faster now, because if she stopped to think about what she was saying, she'd lose her courage entirely. "I know this is crazy. I know I sound like a madwoman who's been alone too long and has developed feelings for an animal because she's so starved for connection that she'll take whatever she can get. But here's the thing. Here's what I've realized over these past 3 weeks. I don't care that you're a wolf right now. I don't care that I don't know your name or your history, or whether you're an alpha or a beta or an omega like me. I don't care about any of that because I care about you, about the soul I've seen in your eyes, about the gentleness you've shown me, about the way you listen when I talk, like what I'm saying actually matters, about the way you've made me feel less alone than I've felt in my entire life. And maybe that's not true love. Maybe real true love takes months or years to develop, and what I'm feeling is just gratitude or companionship or the desperate attachment of a lonely person to the first creature who's shown her kindness. But maybe it's enough. Maybe caring genuinely is enough. Maybe choosing to try even when failure seems certain is enough. Because what do I have to lose except the dignity I lost years ago when my pack decided I wasn't worth remembering? She leaned forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, and she could see the curse mark on his chest, glowing brighter now, pulsing with dark energy, as if it sensed what she was about to do and was preparing to defend itself. And she thought about Morgana Darkrose somewhere out there, the witch who'd done this terrible thing. And she thought about all the people who'd tried to break this curse and failed. And she thought about how presumptuous it was to believe that she, a nobody omega with no pack status and no special training, could succeed where so many others had apparently failed. "I don't know if this will work," she whispered, and she was close enough now that she could feel his breath on her face, could see her reflection in his ice-blue eyes, could sense the rapid beating of his heart that matched her own panicked rhythm. "I don't know if what I feel is the kind of love the curse requires. I don't even really know what love is supposed to feel like because no one's ever loved me, and I've never had the chance to love anyone. But I know that when I look at you, I see someone worth saving, someone worth fighting for, someone I want to live because the world would be darker without you in it. And if that's not love, then I don't know what is. And if it's not enough to break the curse, then at least you'll know that someone cared. That someone chose you not for what you could give them, but just because you're you. And maybe that matters. Maybe that's worth something, even if it doesn't break the magic. She kissed him then, pressed her lips gently to his forehead, right between those intelligent eyes. And she felt the moment her lips made contact, like an electric shock that ran through her entire body. Felt the curse mark react violently. Felt magic explode outward from the point of contact in waves that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cottage, and she was thrown backward by the force of it, her back hitting the wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, and she watched in stunned amazement as brilliant silver light erupted from the wolf's body. So bright she had to shield her eyes. So powerful she could feel it in her bones, in her blood, in the very core of her being, and the light seemed to be tearing something apart, seemed to be unraveling the dark magic strand by strand, seemed to be breaking 4 years of suffering in the space of heartbeats. When the light faded and Sarah could see again, blinking away the spots dancing across her vision, there was no longer a wolf lying on her cottage floor. There was a man, tall and powerfully built with silver hair that matched her own, and those same ice-blue eyes that had haunted her for 3 weeks, and he was naked and unconscious and breathing, actually breathing, his chest rising and falling with no curse mark marring the skin. Just a faint silver scar where the dark magic had been, and Sarah stared at him in shock, unable to process what had just happened, unable to believe that she'd actually done it, that she'd broken a curse that had trapped him for 4 years when hundreds of others had failed, that her kiss had been enough, that her feelings had been real enough, pure enough, genuine enough to satisfy whatever impossible requirements the dark magic had demanded. "What did I do?" she breathed, and it wasn't really a question, because she knew what she'd done. She'd saved him, she'd freed him, she'd proven that sometimes the most powerful magic in the world came not from ancient bloodlines, or extensive training, or years of study, but from a lonely Omega who'd chosen to care about a dying stranger. And the magnitude of that realization was almost too much to bear, because if she could do this, if she could break curses and save lives and be genuinely important to someone, then maybe she wasn't as forgettable and worthless as she'd spent her entire life believing. Maybe Elena had been right about the silver marking the bloodline. Maybe she really was a soul weaver. Maybe everything she'd thought was a curse about herself was actually a blessing she'd never learned to recognize. The man stirred, gasping as consciousness returned, and his ice-blue eyes opened wide, looking first at his hands as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. Then at her, and she saw tears streaming down his face, saw joy and disbelief and something that looked like reverence in his expression. And when he spoke, his voice was rough from years of disuse, but filled with such emotion it made her chest ache. "You broke it," he said, and his voice was beautiful, deep, and warm, and everything she'd imagined during the lonely nights when she'd wondered what he might sound like if he could speak. "After 4 years, after hundreds of attempts, after I'd given up all hope, you broke it. You freed me. You saved my life in ways I can't even begin to explain, and I don't even know your name. I don't know who you are except that you're the woman who cared for me when I was dying, who talked to me through the darkness, who chose to try even when you thought it was hopeless, who gave me true love's kiss without even knowing that's what it was. And I owe you everything, my life, my freedom, my future, everything. Sarah, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, still trying to process the fact that the wolf was a man now, that her cottage contained a naked stranger who was looking at her like she'd hung the moon and stars. My name is Sarah Moonwhisper, and I'm nobody important, just a forgotten Omega from the Shadowmere pack who lives alone and makes potions, and I didn't know the kiss would work. I couldn't let you die. I couldn't walk away from your suffering, and I think I fell in love with you, even though I'd never seen you like this, even though I didn't know your name or your story, and I know that sounds insane, but it's the truth. And if breaking the curse means you're going to leave now and go back to whatever life you had before, then I understand. I don't expect anything from you just because I helped. I just wanted you to live. I just wanted you to be free. The man was on his feet now, moving toward her with a grace that was almost predatory despite his obvious weakness from years in wolf form, and he knelt before her where she still sat against the wall, and he took her hands in his, and she noticed they were both trembling, both overwhelmed by what had just happened, both trying to navigate this new reality where the wolf was a man and the forgotten Omega had broken an unbreakable curse. My name is Cassian Silverclaw, he said, and she gasped because even in her isolation she'd heard that name, had heard the stories about the Alpha King who disappeared 4 years ago, cursed by the woman he was supposed to marry, presumed dead by most of the kingdom, and she was staring at him in shock as he continued. I was cursed by Morgana Darkrose, trapped in wolf form, slowly dying, and I've spent 4 years wandering, trying to find someone who could break the curse, and hundreds tried, nobles and omegas and alphas seeking power or status, and every single one failed because they didn't love me. They loved what I represented, but you, Sarah Moonwhisper, you loved me without knowing I was a king, without knowing what you'd gain. You loved a dying wolf because you couldn't walk away from suffering, and that kind of love, pure and selfless and freely given, that's what broke the curse. That's what saved me, and I need you to know something before anything else happens. Before we deal with Morgana or my kingdom or any of the complications that are coming. He brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with such reverence it made fresh tears spill down her cheeks. And when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion, with years of loneliness and suffering finally finding relief, with the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been saved from a fate worse than death. I fell in love with you too, he said, and the words hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect and terrifying. I fell in love with you when you dragged me inside, even though I could have killed you, when you worked all night to keep me alive, when you talked to me about your loneliness and your dreams and your fears like I was a person worth confiding in, when you promised you wouldn't give up on me even though you had no reason to believe you could help, and I fell in love with you more every single day of these past 3 weeks. Watching you care for me, listening to you read, feeling your gentle hands healing my wounds, and I know this is complicated. I know I'm an Alpha King with a kingdom to reclaim and an enemy to face. But before we deal with any of that, I need you to know that you're not nobody. You're not forgettable. You're not just a forgotten Omega who makes potions. You're the woman who saved my life, the soul weaver who broke a dark curse, the person I want standing beside me for the rest of my life. And I'm asking you, Sarah Moonwhisper, if you'll let me love you back, if you'll let me show you that you matter, that you're valued, that you deserve everything good in this world, because you gave me back my life, and I want to spend that life making sure you never feel forgotten or alone again. Sarah couldn't speak through her tears, couldn't find words adequate to express the overwhelming emotions flooding through her, so she just nodded and let him pull her into his arms. Let herself be held by someone who saw her, really saw her, who valued her, not for what she could do, but for who she was. And she felt the mate bond snap into place between them, warm and right and perfect. And she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just changed forever. That the forgotten Omega had found her place, her purpose, her home, in the arms of a cursed king she'd saved with nothing more than compassion and stubborn determination and a love she hadn't even known she was capable of feeling. The road ahead would be difficult, she knew that, because Morgana was still out there, still ruling Cassian's kingdom, still powerful and dangerous, and certainly not going to give up her stolen throne without a fight. But for the first time in her 24 years, Sarah wasn't facing the future alone, wasn't forgotten or overlooked or deemed unworthy. She was chosen and valued and loved by someone who'd seen her at her most vulnerable, her most ordinary, her most honestly herself, and had decided she was exactly what he needed, exactly what he wanted, exactly enough just as she was, silver hair and healing gifts and gentle heart that refused to give up on suffering creatures, even when caring meant risking everything. And as Cassian held her close and whispered promises against her hair about the future they'd build together, about making her his Luna and his queen, about showing the world that the forgotten Omega was actually the most important person in the kingdom, Sarah finally understood what Elna had meant about the silver marking the bloodline, about trusting her heart, about being what he needed, because she'd always been a soul weaver, had always possessed the power to break curses and heal corrupted souls. She just needed to find someone worth saving, someone who would recognize her worth in return, someone whose brokenness matched her own in ways that meant they could heal each other and become whole together. Two silver-haired souls who'd been lost in the darkness and found their way home through the simple magic of choosing to love without conditions, without expectations, without any guarantee of reward, except the knowledge that caring mattered, that gentleness was strength, that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was just a lonely Omega who refused to let a dying wolf freeze on her doorstep. And as the sun rose higher over the forgotten woods and painted the cottage in shades of gold and silver, Sarah Moonwhisper finally stopped being forgotten and became instead the most remembered, the most valued, the most loved woman in the entire kingdom. All because she'd chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier, chosen hope when despair seemed more logical, chosen love when she had no reason to believe it would be returned, and in doing so had broken not just one curse, but two, freeing Cassian from his magical prison and freeing herself from the loneliness that had imprisoned her just as surely. Proving once and for all that true love's kiss wasn't a fairy tale, but a real magic that lived in the hearts of those brave enough to care unconditionally, and that sometimes the most ordinary people possess the most extraordinary gifts. They just needed someone to see them clearly enough to recognize the blessing that everyone else had dismissed as a curse. If you enjoyed this story of Sarah and Cassian, of the forgotten Omega and the cursed Alpha King who found each other in the darkness and chose love over fear, please let me know what you thought in the comments below. Tell me which moment touched your heart most, whether it was Sarah dragging the dying wolf inside despite her fear, or Cassian revealing he'd loved her all along, or that final moment when the curse broke and two lonely souls finally found their home in each other. And please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story about werewolf romance, about alpha kings and rejected mates, about powerful Omegas discovering their worth, about fated destinies and the kind of love that breaks curses and transforms lives. Because there are so many more stories to tell about wolves who find their mates in unexpected places, about the magic that lives in choosing compassion over cruelty, about ordinary people who turn out to be extraordinary when given the chance to shine. So hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join me for the next tale of transformation and true love. Because in a world that often feels dark and cold and lonely, we all need stories that remind us that sometimes the most powerful magic is just choosing to care, choosing to try, choosing to love even when we have no guarantee it will be enough. And I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember that being different isn't a curse. It's a gift waiting to be recognized. And somewhere out there, someone is waiting to see you clearly, to value you completely, to love you exactly as you are, silver hair and gentle heart and all.